Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Stefanos Geroulanos, who is a professor of history at New York University and also the author of this book, The Invention of Prehistory, Empire, Violence, and Our Obsession with Human Origins. Welcome, Stefanos.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg.
Well, look, I've done a lot of podcasts where we have tried to define what it is to be human, what it means to be human. And in almost all of these, there's been some kind of transition point where we went from being non-human to being human, right? Whether it's the ability to use language or the ability to use tools or, the ability to construct culture or whatever. And I think we're all kind of fascinated with the historical origins precisely because we're interested in who we are, right? Yeah. Defining what we are. And even though human nature is a term that's sort of out of fashion, I mean, we're all trying to figure out what human nature is. And I think there was a quote in the book, and I couldn't figure out who it was you were quoting, but you said that natural philosophy and history, presumably, breathes the past with its own lungs, or the historian always breathes the past with his own lungs. And that means that it's almost impossible to escape the sin of presentism, right? Like we're always studying the past because we're trying to figure out the present. And you say that there's been a ton of progress in human origins, the study of human origins, a ton of progress when it comes to the facts, right, and what's happened. But it's not clear whether we are kind of extracting the meaning of these facts in a way that's any better than we were back in the time of Tacitus, even, or in the 19th century. So I guess the question is, the people who are studying the past, is it possible for them to not concern themselves with how these stories will be interpreted, or do they always have to worry about the interpretation and the meaning that people get from these stories?
So, I mean, you've gone right to the heart of the matter. I agree with you that it's incredibly difficult to parse between these two options. On the one hand, yes, we all have big questions, and somehow pretending that people will not answer them or will not answer them in a way that makes sense to them in an immediate context, we simply can't do that. At the same time, worrying about these answers isn't a particularly bad problem in the scale of horrors in the world, let's say. So the way that I tend to see the problem is that human origins became really key at several stages, and at each of those stages, something absolutely current or something truly urgent was in play. Some of these moments had to do with an overcoming of traditional religious answers. Others had to do with an overcoming of ideas of human nature, so that certain kinds of stability of human nature and so on, let's not pretend that they simply disappeared, but they did become secondary. And so human origins research came to, fill that void. And in some respects, that's a real advance. And in some respects, that's a problem. It's a real advance to the extent that it is a really scientific, properly studied attempt that gets undone every little while, where you have new developments and new kinds of push and so on. It is a problem because, of course, we're all, there's no general or great story, so to speak, that isn't entirely folded through what we think of ourselves. And if the question really is who we are, then of course we have a sense of who we are. It's not like we're simply going to get rid of it. And so in what I would wish, if you will, if that's part of the question, what I would wish is for people to be particularly careful about this, because in a way, there isn't, through 2.5 centuries that were the heart of this book, or let's say 1.5 century, which is like the bulk of the 400 pages, it is incredibly difficult to find a moment where people didn't have an answer that was also a disaster. That led to plausible results that were also disastrous. So to address a different implicit question in your text, yes, in your text and your question, yes, it's also not an attempt to blame the scientists. it's just an incredibly difficult point to say, where do you draw the line? If there is a problem, is it simply a political problem? I really don't think so. I don't think politics needs human origins research to come up with results, but I do think that it makes very elaborate use of them, even in things we don't really know, we don't really notice. And on the other hand, it's not as though scientists aren't human beings, and it's not as though they don't speak the language that the rest of us speak. It's not as though these things are simply separate. So there's a really interesting problem whereby we answer the question of who we are, and then we have to somehow second guess, where skepticism is a good thing. So that's what I meant by worrying about it as a good problem to have.
Well, it seems like all social scientists and even natural scientists, they find it difficult to avoid some kind of teleological story, right? There's some notion of progress, right? And I think this is becomes particularly acute whenever there are encounters between people of different, with different ways of living. So I think a lot of the thoughts about progress happened when the Romans encountered the Germans, right? And when the Spanish encountered the Native Americans, and when the colonialists encountered the Africans and so forth, and they wanted to come up with some metric of progress, right? Like, are we more advanced or better than them, and are there parallels between what we're seeing in the present and what we used to live like back in the day? I mean, why? I mean, what's the obsession with progress? Is it because we want to tell this grand story of like some wonderful Whig history of humanity? Is that the idea?
So yes and no. I think one version of it is that it is about, I think, particularly from the middle of the 19th century onward, there was a very strong desire to have a series of answers that confirmed the people asking them. So everybody has had a myth. There's no, we all live with myths all the time. We may undo some of them, but those don't go away. So in Britain, France, Germany, the idea that you needed to be able to make comparisons was not only essential, but also somehow compelled by technological advances. And difference between an industrializing people and the pre-industrial people was overwhelming, and it had everything to do with, the power that they could exert far from home, but also the question of, are we really authentic anymore? Are we really people? Have we become something different? That kind of anxiety appears again and again. And at the same time, there was, and I really don't want to downplay this, there was a considerable humanitarian concern in the 19th century with, once the question of slavery was at least intellectually handled, politically is another matter, then the question was, who are the people who are suffering the most? Now, traditionally, the answer had been relatively straightforward. We will Christianize them. But then the answer as regards Native peoples around the world became one of, look, they have no culture in the way that we mean it. They, have all these customs that appear savage and unacceptable. But we do know better. We don't, think of custom X and we leave it there. And so that scenario created both a need to differentiate and a need to kind of bring in. A need to encompass. And at the same time, there was elaborate humanitarian realization that Native peoples around the world were dying, that societies were collapsing, that the transformations inflicted on these societies were often far worse. And I think there was a very serious question, particularly after Darwin, is this just happening because it's a law of nature? So why do we need a version of progress? At the time, I think one profound need was to say that, not simply look at us and compare us, but also let us understand where we have come and what we can do for others. And at other times, let us see how we can, take advantage of others. There's that too. In the middle of the 20th century, The question of progress was a bit different. Some of it was that technological progress is obviously happening. And that is happening at a different kind of rate and in a different style. It's a kind of mechanization of the world that we can't control. So how do we respond to that? And in what way can we understand ourselves as progressing? Are we progressing morally? Could somebody really say that there was moral progress after the Holocaust? So those scenarios played in and out, I think, time and time again. And more recently, in a way, I think, again, the question, is AI overtaking us, is a question that feeds into many of these questions of who are we in relation to what we have created, in relation to what we have become, and in what way could we as human beings, I overuse we in these phrasings, but it's more straightforward, in what way could we as human beings guarantee that we're in control of this, that we have, some way of relating to our world, and that there's something morally good about us despite everything. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you devote an almost equal amount of time to the counter narrative, right? Which is that, things have gone downhill, right? That there was this, paradise in primitive world. I mean, it's basically the Rousseau versus Hobbes story, and it keeps kind of rearing its head over and over and over again. I mean, I remember meeting Nap Chagnon back in the day, and he would represent sort of the Hobbesian side of things, yes. And Marshall Salins was sort of the Rousseauvian side of things. I mean, this seems like a debate that just keeps recurring over and over and over again. Are we getting better or are we getting worse? Right, the Whig story versus the sort of counter Whig story. Yeah. Is it really the same debate over and over and over again, or have there been sort of changes in the balance of power between those two?
Right. You're also describing the way that the recent David Graeber and David Wengrow book, the Dawn of Everything, set the frame that it's a Rousseau versus Hobbes setup. I tend to think that it isn't, but for reasons that are a little obscure in some ways. So I don't think that the two are positions that are well established throughout and that then simply get reactivated. I think that they get cited because they're easy solutions. By contrast, what interested me more was the way in which these are blended into one another over and over and over again until they get picked up on particular occasions. So at one level, this is really a book about language. It's a book about the way in which we talk about ourselves and the way in which we describe others, and the way in which it's not simply the major well-known concepts that make up our life, but like little unknown things. This bomb them back to the Stone Age scenario, which was used just last week in reference to Lebanon. So from my perspective, it's about how language comes to condition the answers that we give to the questions that we ask. But by all means, on the one hand, the Hobbesian question has kept reappearing. For example, when Darwin more or less suggests that it is an unfortunate fact of nature that people who are not as civilized as their conquerors are going to, quote unquote, disappear. It then does appear again in the 20th century on several occasions, most notably in the killer ape scenario. Like the beginning was a gruesome story of apes, of Australopithecines, basically not apes anymore, that ate each other versus the alternative, as you put it, which is a much more peaceful one. I don't think that most of the
chimp versus bonobo debate.
Yeah, exactly.
Which of them are kindred spirits, right?
And I think, so think of the famous moment when Jane Goodall discovers that the chimps can actually be super violent. And then suddenly the entire discussion shifts from one that was like, Jane Goodall out in, the paradise of the jungle with this sort of wonderful little community, to one in which it's like, oh, wow, Hobbes is alive again. I don't necessarily think that the two of them describe most of the occasions of these discussions. In large part because everybody's trying to say, I'm a good scientist. I'm not, I don't simply think that this is the same kind of, or even that they say my politics isn't as basic as that Rousseauian look into the state of nature. But you're quite right that the two terms do keep showing up time and time again, even though some of the greater both successes and horrors of the story as it comes up aren't really about a kind of easy determination and easy break with this past. Yeah. Sorry,
Well,
that was too
I mean,
long.
that debate over whether, humans were originally good or bad in state of nature, I mean, that's been going on for a long time. But the bulk of your book really focuses on how these conversations were impacted by the scientific discoveries, right, that have happened in the last. So whether it's the discovery of fossils, right, which said something about other species of origin, or the discoveries about cave art and other things. So how, maybe go back to the discovery of the kind of Indo-European language family. I think that was a huge moment, right, in our understanding of the past, and that seemed to have all sorts of ramifications all the way through to the Nazi era.
Yes, and beyond it too. So in the late 18th century, the idea that Sanskrit is not just occasionally linked to Greek and Latin, but has structural, affinities with it, and that you can kind of work your way between the three, became an obsession of linguists in the early 19th century. It became a major issue for Romantic ideas of the past. It indicated that there was a language far beyond Greece and Rome that linked the two, that then linked them to Celtic and German and other languages. And so suddenly this idea was that you could give a linguistic description, a linguistic geography of the world that went all the way to India in some respects, even though the motherland was unclear. And so this generated generations upon generations of people who tried to understand what model they could use to compare these languages. How do they look back to early human history through them, or the moment of the discovery of language? As Max Muller says somewhere, it's all very good and true that humans come from apes, but that doesn't mean anything about the one key moment, namely that apes don't speak and humans do. And that lineage becomes both fascinating and mythological. There's a now relatively old book by the late Maurice Hollander, Olender, called The Languages of Paradise, which is a very condensed version of some of these debates, from Leibniz thinking about Scythia to the way that this becomes a concern all the way to the Nazis. And the real question becomes a question of okay, so where are we really from? Who are we most closely related to? Are we separate peoples on the basis of our language? And to what extent is there separation and commonality? This, of course, means that separation is greater with Semitic languages, Finno-Ugric languages, Turkic, and so on. So there suddenly you get a negative space of the dream of Europe, in which Jews, Arabs, Turks, in some respects, Hungarians who are also derided as descendants of Huns and Magyars, who are not quite seen there. That becomes a description, a map. So that, as you said, becomes really key with the Nazis, and then you see a lot of people trying to keep versions of it going. The other two examples that you used, fossils and caves. The cave paintings are probably my personal favorite chapter in the book. They have a mystery that is incredibly meaningful to me, and at the same time, it's the moment when you just want to be able to break out of the terms you've set for your own project to say there's something truly extraordinary. And I also know that I only know them on the basis of representations. The same thing about fossils. When you and I grew up, fossils were interpreted in particular ways, and some of these have really stuck with me. I'm guessing that others would have stuck with you as well. It's something that I find utterly compelling about the question of what is it about a representation that we know about, yet have largely forgotten, in terms of what those beings were. So largely forgotten. It's like if I see it again, I'll recognize it, but until then, it means nothing. So,
Well, what I found interesting about that discussion was that the barbarians, sometimes the barbarians were the other, and sometimes they were us, right? And
yes.
so the Germans, right, would sometimes take pride in the fact that they were the barbarians, because they ultimately prevailed over the Romans. That meant that they were the good guys, the strong ones. And then the bad barbarians, they're the Huns, because they attacked the Germans. But then the British would call the Germans Huns, and so basically a Hun is any bad barbarian. Although I bet the Huns have a different view on this.
Right, like the Mongols for them too. It's kind of amazing that these scenarios were constructed. That they were both rigid and pliable. If you asked who is it who belongs into each category, somebody would be able to answer that question for you. If you tried to say, well, actually, let's just, we need to switch the terms a little bit and make them more effective, or we won't use this model because now they're our friends, we're going to use that model for criticizing or attacking, that became really kind of incredibly important just as well, that these were models that could be adjusted. And that, I think, also became really key. So one example of a model that gets adjusted, when Raymond Dart finds or is given the skull of the Tong baby that becomes the Australopithecus africanus, he gives these like super goth descriptions of Australopithecine violence, and they go on and on for pages, and then he becomes famous through it. Robert Ardrey makes him famous in the US, and there's the Kubrick's 2001, The Dawn of Man belongs into that story. And yet just maybe 5 years after The Dawn of Man, you get Jacob Bronowski in The Ascent of Man, beginning his whole TV series by holding a replica of the Tong baby skull, and he sort of moves around and says what Dart discovered is that these teeth were just really, they were not the big fighting canines of the apes. This was not a violent being. And you just say, wait, what? This was how the whole story had gone. But the contextualization of that skull into a different frame, where there were so many other Australopithecines that were really just herbivores, made it clear that this was not simply a story of violence. It could be adjusted to retain some of that, but really to deprioritize it. And then you say, we're not great because we've overcome violence. You can say we're great because we arose. What does he say? He uses, if I'm not mistaken, the term that Bronowski uses, like that the human posture, humans needed a different posture and a different dispensation toward the world. And that's how they came to conquer it. So it's fascinating. You can use these visions of ourselves that are both so vastly different and yet so close to one another in order to make the argument stick.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the same fact can be used for completely opposite purposes, right? So you talk about the out of Africa story, right? So the idea that we now know or have strong confidence that humans evolved in Africa and then moved out of Africa. And so, for some people, this is like, yeah, we got out of that place. We're better because we're more advanced, we're more civilized the farther you are from Africa. But then the negritude movement is like, no, like we're the ones that started it all. Yes. So you can take the same fact and basically insert implication depending on what you're trying to show, right?
Yes, and you can play with it or negotiate it according to different framework. So yes, exactly. For not only did negritude use the Leo Frobenius's argument, which was by no means originally an advocacy of African, it was an advocacy of the authenticity of African culture, because he was a collector and he wanted it to matter. Also because he was a critic of European and especially German pretensions to a different kind of culture. But this wasn't exactly a kind of grand celebration. By the time of Senghor and then again, later of Kwame Nkrumah, his work becomes a liberation story of exactly the same expressions, which then proceeds to shadow the more official out of Africa scenario. And of course, everybody attacks each other, because the alternative scenario for a while to the out of Africa hypothesis was a polycentric hypothesis, which on the one hand just was just a different version of 19th century polygenism, or sounded like a different version of 19th century polygenism, which is that different races are fundamentally different species, when for many of the people who were advocating a modern version of this, it wasn't the different races are different species, but that rather you simply can't have a kind of tree of derivation, a simple, the branching out story that we see in most of these representations, but you need to assume that there is, mating between different species and different kinds of humans, where species and race are very unclear limits as to what works and what doesn't, and how some, or what the relations between these different groups would end up being. So what you described before, the thank goodness we ran out of Africa, is the accusation directed at some by others who are trying to set up, to avoid a different kind of racist implication that they're racist. And so on the one hand, that debate heats up way too much, precisely because these are things that cannot be taken, with a little bit of distance. This isn't about you and me. It is about what happened at a different time. It is about how we need to think of this with a kind of, how much of a clean lens can we possibly wear as we look back. And on the other hand, the same fact is going to be played out over and over and over, because this past lacks, it has so much meaning, and it is in such a giant void. Margaret Conkey famously argued in the late 70s and early 80s that, it wasn't good enough to simply get rid of man the hunter, woman the gatherer. You had to simply say that you know nothing. You just have to be, you haven't even looked at where the different objects are in a given location, in a given dig, and what kind of meaning this would have, or what world of, permutations of how to interpret that space we would need. So it's utterly fascinating, and slight changes make a major difference.
Well, and some people are so addicted to so dedicated to a particular inference that they are willing to fudge the facts. So you showed these maps that the Germans came up with that showed that all of the Indo-Europeans, or I guess Indo-Germanics, originated in Germany. these spread out of Germany, I guess, because they were so committed to the idea that, well, the place where you start must be the best place. So, the Hindi must have come from Germany.
Yeah, it's also something interesting, right? So how much importance would it have had that they used the term Indo-German? That the term Indo-German stuck. For others who spoke of Indo-European, they weren't too happy to have it start in Germany. But it was clear that the European was the kind of language that would take priority. But is it that, let's say 30 years after you use the term, some of us use some of these terms without really meaning very much out of them. But is it that after a point, the term had become so meaningful that was the only map imaginable, where other archaeological discoveries could be interpreted in this way? And there are some, I talk only a very few, but from Gustav Cosina's time, and not only because he too was a nationalist of this variety, but from his time, there's also this sort of obsessive argument that Germany is a cultural center, so pottery moves outward during particular periods. It doesn't arrive as derivative from somewhere else. So to me, this question of, chicken and egg at some level, once language and images and myth come into play, they become really, really key. My other favorite about the story is that people who were so invested in the Nazi version of this argument, then 1950 comes and, Georges Dumézil, for example, he just republishes the same book flipping the location as though it's like, oh, well, we always thought this. And he does have very serious, interesting arguments on the other side. Like, these aren't, I don't want to simply belittle every argument made in the book on the basis of sometimes the flimsiness, sometimes the ugliness of some of this. And so I do over-concentrate in some respects on making this story, the continuous version of the story, work, without always saying, everything about this was horrible. But yes, that's it's kind of amazing. But then Dumézil gets picked up by the New Right in the 80s as an avatar of so-called ethno-pluralism in Europe, which basically sounded pretty at the time, but what it meant is no immigrants, please. You stay at your culture and we'll stay with ours. So those sorts of, then the movement becomes a story of here's when we became authentic. New movements simply destroy this authenticity. So there are also multiple new versions, perhaps unexpected, that could be played out in terms of the politics of this all.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the language of hordes, right, and the invading hordes comes up quite a bit. But I mean, I think there's also this story about the use of the term race and the term species, right, and how those terms have evolved and kind of mixed and separated. And so when people are referring to the, say, Neanderthals, sometimes they would refer to it as a race, sometimes as a species, and those would have implications for how people categorized humans, contemporary humans, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So so in the beginning, particularly in Britain, it's very unclear whether the Neanderthals should be understood, the original Neanderthal skulls should be understood as a separate species. And so then the comparison is made with skulls of actually existing indigenous peoples from various locations. And then, the graphs are put in the books and this becomes one standard. In French, the ambiguity is even harder because race was used interchangeably as though it could refer to one or the other. So when it becomes clear that Neanderthals were a separate species, it isn't as though that's an advance in some respects and it's a problem in others. In some respects, it says, like, look, we didn't come from this one. So then what is it exactly? And why is it here and not somewhere else? But then it also regenerates, or let's say it gives this impression of cleaning the fossil record, which is a record that's mostly populated by actually existing, the skulls of actually existing peoples. So those scenarios remain really, really very ambiguous. And then again, in the late 20th century, the question between, and early 21st century, the difference between species and race regarding Neanderthals comes to be at issue once again. If they could mate, then, in popular perception, they simply couldn't be a separate species. But then that generates all sorts of other political issues, namely that the people who simply refer to different races then refer to the African biological race of Homo sapiens, that's a quote, versus the European one of Neanderthal. Now, I don't think that people mean immediately very ill, but the way this sounds and the way that this plays out and the way that this is picked up politically is very, very clear. And one needs to be incredibly careful about that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, I remember when calling someone a Neanderthal was an insult, right? Yes. You were barbaric and savage and stupid, right? And now people brag about their Neanderthal
their DNA
heritage, right? 23andMe. I mean, I have a colleague at work, and he's like, "I'm 3%. Like, what are you?" And then you got to look at the thing, and how did that happen? And you told in the book, you describe how there are certain, I guess, European racists who the Neanderthal was the original white man, right? And right. Was exterminated by these people coming from out of Africa. This was news to me. I had no idea that there's actually, I mean, that's kind of an interesting take on the whole story, right?
So I, for example, would have known of Neanderthals thanks to Clan of the Cave Bear, for example.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then
Remember that?
so where Daryl Hannah is the Cro-Magnon and the brutish Neanderthals are the ones who, destroy, rape, hurt, and then she has to fight back. So that's one. And then
They're the other. They're the other, right?
they're the other, right?
Yeah,
Um,
they're the barbaric folks, and the Homo sapiens is the civilized ones, right?
Exactly, or at least, blonder, whiter, and so on. And yes, somewhat more civilized. And there were similar versions I'm forgetting the title of the Jean-Jacques Hano film from the early 80s that similarly, that has similar kind of coding. Now, what that suggested was that there is a plausible intimacy between the two groups. Both films played around that idea because it was already known that the two groups had overlapped. But so the question is, what do you make of that then? But the idea was that the brute is the Neanderthal. It's like that guy's a Neanderthal. By the early 2000s, it was also clear that the traditional image of the Neanderthal as hairy, gorilla-ish, super hunched, unable to take the world in clearly, that those images from the 50s, 60s, even the 70s were very outdated, that the posture, the tools left behind at site, or the tools that, that could be recovered at Neanderthal sites, the kinds of hunts, the kinds of, prepared jewelry and so on, that these were not simply, that these were indications of at least complex culture. And so the depictions started to change. And the deciphering of the Neanderthal genome did a lot more for this. The result of that, so partly for reasons of genetics, it became clear that their skin was likely lighter, certainly lighter than had been depicted, that their hair is routinely represented now as either blonde or red, and that or brown, and that their eyes are depicted as lighter as well. Which, in some climate-based theory would also have seemed to work. Like if they lived with the glaciers for forever, that would have gone. But the translation then became very easy that if you are someone who believes that, immigrants are causing a white genocide, if you are someone who believes that these people, that these, ancient people were white and somehow authentic, then it's no big step to turn around and say, one, two, see what's going to happen now. And so all you need to do, which I don't necessarily recommend, is look online for Neanderthal white genocide. And you find various passages of people, we're not exactly talking about people who are really serious scientifically here, but who give endless description. How did tolerance work out for the Neanderthals? How did how did accepting migrants work out for them? And so that scenario plays itself out and threatens to become a serious version. Now, it does need to be said that, of course, this is, the idea that one group simply killed off the other is not the one that's largely accepted at present. It also needs to be said that alternatives also are times kind of confusing or complicated. Are we speaking of hierarchical relations when we see the two groups potentially mixing? Are we speaking, I keep saying groups in order to avoid, what do you call it? I say groups in order to avoid using race or species. Are we speaking of disease? Questions about disease arose in 2020. Again, this happened, with interest in plagues because of COVID-19. So all of these questions they're so written into where we are that the answers, again, should be a little bit tentative, but they get really, really fascinating in this story.
Okay, hold on. My microphone just flipped. Let me see if I can flip this back. Okay, let me stop this. And No, here we
go
go.
back?
We're good. Okay, so but what's interesting is it seems like this story or the receptivity to this story parallels sort of a change in our perspective on why indigenous people have been disappearing right along the world. I think it used to be the
Yes.
story that the reason why they were disappearing is because they were violent and barbaric and savage. And now it seems like the general consensus is that they disappear because they're peaceful. Right? And that we think about the Native American as being one with the land and the and
Yeah.
peaceful, the noble savage and so forth. So it seems like there's been a shift in how we think about indigenous people, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, absolutely. To close off the Neanderthal thought from before, there is a moment. This is from a book called Neanderthals Reconsidered, where they note that in the 70s, Neanderthals became sort of super Native Americans, like the super trackers, and so all the literature moved in that, all the literary depictions moved in that direction. But so yes, there is a version whereby peaceful is one element that really matters, and the sense of violence and antiquity is a different is a different element that plays a role. So one version of disappearance was simply a kind of fantasy of native peoples as savage. Of course, they kill each other off; they don't know how to handle. And then came the evolutionary argument, which is one of the darkest sides of evolutionary theory, which simply said, just as there's a struggle for survival among, other species, the same thing happens with humans. And the ones that simply don't manage to survive simply don't manage to survive. They disappear for a multitude of factors which have to do with their ostensible inferiority. And so in The Descent of Man, in the second edition of The Descent of Man, Darwin is quite explicit about this. That scenario played well into Victorian politics, and then into the 20th century, you had two versions. One version kind of derived from this, and some anthropologists sort of the older school had a largely racially based set of answers. A second response was one supported, say, by Victor Segalin, and then Ruth Benedict and Claude Lévi-Strauss, who much more clearly said, these are not fundamentally violent people. The violence is an imputation. What they do and how they live their life is a fundamentally separate, different way that we cannot ever dream of experiencing. And that generates the idea that there is, on the one hand, there's like an obvious colonial imposition on native peoples. On the other hand, there is no possible or active answer to that. And that seems to be the argument that we have to this day, that simply there could be no adequate answer. Fight back and you're a savage who's going to be attacked. Don't fight back and you're a weakling who's going to either be assimilated or just sort of wiped out. Add all the biological consequences, plagues and so on, for example, and so you get to these results. Now, by the 1970s, 1980s, the debate started again with Chagnon, for example, as you mentioned before, where the idea is that there is, for Chagnon, as for Steven Pinker more recently, as for Jared Diamond, there is a fundamental brutal violence that's characteristic of indigenous peoples, or at least of the indigenous peoples worth mentioning.
This is the thin veneer story, right?
It's the thin veneer story. But that goes in a slightly different version, the thin veneer story, in the sense that, in the sense that we can never really overcome the thin veneer. It's kind of forever hiding in there.
Scratch the surface and people will kill their neighbors, right? So yes, like in Bosnia, right? If there's the tiniest crack in social order and everybody goes back to, man is wolf to man.
Exactly. So that's the thin veneer argument, which is slightly different from the look how far we have come, which is really, in a way, Chagnon is somewhere closer to the thin veneer argument. Pinker and Diamond are much closer to the look how far we have how far we have gone. Yuval Harari is very much on the look how far we have gone as well. And so on the, so just to conclude that thought, what partly happened was that indigenous peoples and, let's say prehistoric humans or hominins were seen as still having a kind of tenuous connection, but there is also a break there. The argument becomes, when did war begin? And if war began 100,000 years ago, we're all fundamentally warmongers. If war began between like 30 and 10,000 years ago, then there's a different story. We're not fundamentally warmongers. It's about the development of basic societies. That there's something about that development that enables us to be both peaceful, fundamentally, but also willing to carry out war. The thin veneer argument is itself really fascinating. That was perhaps the one expression that I tracked most carefully through a whole long period, in part because it's relatively easy to search. Thin veneer could also just refer to, vernissage and furniture. But so as you're researching this, including in digital data sets, then you get rid of the furniture, and then you go book by book by book and see what it goes for. And there the argument was, you should totally be a warmonger, because in fact your enemy is a warmonger and savage, and you need to be able to respond. So the colonial origins of that are very, very explicit. L. Rider Haggard of King Solomon's Mines and so on uses the term so often, Tarzan and so on. But then the story takes a weird roundabout path where it becomes important to psychologists. Freud is one of them, sort of famously, and then others like Gustave Le Bon and so on. And then from them, it goes to military psychologists who take it back into the army, just as the story is easy to take up right around World War I. So even if you really, whether you want to say, look, we should preserve the little that we've managed to do over our innate savagery, or you say, like, you know what, you're in the trench, he's going to kill you if you don't kill him, go for it. Those both become scenarios in which language determines where we end up living and what we think.
Yeah, and there is a whole debate in the military about the extent to which you need to actually train people to kill, right? So, are you simply untraining them, right? Stripping away their civilized self, or do you actually have to, teach them how to kill, right? There's evidence that most of the bullets fired in I think it was in World War II were missing the mark. And it was because people in part felt very bad about killing other people.
And because overwhelming force feels like, it's no longer your responsibility somehow, unless you end up in an immediate danger, whereupon you're morally justified.
Well, there's another theme in the book, which is all about ruins. And I remember you didn't talk about that, but I think there was a fad in the 18th century, early 19th century for constructing ruins on your property if you were sort of a wealthy person, and it's kind of like a civilizational memento mori, right? Like kind of a yes. But for the grace of God go I, Ozymandias and all of that. I mean, were people were these discoveries? And I think in Rome, right, they started revealing all the Roman ruins. Was this really about reminding people that civilization was super fragile and that it could fall apart at any time?
So on many occasions, that's indeed the case. It was, look at the grandeur of Rome and look what remains now. At other times, it was, so I thought about it in a different, along a different path. I started looking at ruins because, as I was starting to think through the book, I kept wondering, so does this mean that there's a way in which ancient Greece and ancient Rome change in meaning over the 19th century? And yes, there is. That's a different kind of study, but it appeared to me easier to talk about the ruins in that regard. And what is it that survives and what is it that becomes meaningful outside of, Greek nationalist accounts, for example. And there, ruins became really fascinating. I grew up in Greece, so the idea that ruins are meaningful, yes, but they're not too meaningful. You also don't want to be what in Greek is referred to as an archaeolagnis, a sort of idolater of the ruin, a ruinolater. This, and so the idea then would be, okay, so how do these ruins change? And in the 18th century, there is the fad about build and get your own ruins. But there is also the sense that there is some sort of discovery to be associated with this movement back to cities with cities of ruin, cities in ruin. This becomes really key for Winkelmann when he sets up versions of an early version of art history and description of expert descriptions of quote unquote expert descriptions of the past. It becomes really important in the French Revolution, where the question is like, hey, are we making something that should at least last a while and should be really important now that we've destroyed the world that we've brought in? But then by the 1820s, it's interesting that it's not just ruins themselves that matter anymore, but it's that the earth itself appears to be a ruin of itself. It appears in continuity with ruins. And Charles Lyell is really excited and committed to this because he gets to solve, he gets to solve a problem on an actual temple, the Marcellum of Pozzuoli in Italy, where then understood as a temple of Serapis, which he describes as having geologically moved into the water and back out of the water. And he's so excited about this that he uses all these metaphors of ruin, as do many others. John Ruskin, the sort of story can go. But then the language of ruin becomes a language of our own bodies. At first it becomes a language of the tools in the earth. The Paleolithic tools then are ruins of a world, the only ruins of a world that's completely gone, its bones are gone, as everything else has disappeared. But with Darwin, they also enter the body itself.
Like your residual tail or, your appendix or whatever.
Exactly, your appendix, exactly. Yeah. And so then suddenly, I kept thinking in some way whether these stories of prehistory helped convince people about evolution. And I really thought that there were two of them that did. One was the bit that we were saying before about the thin veneer, that people came to use the expression so much and to believe that there is a continuity between our antiquity and now, not simply between an other, meaning an indigenous person somewhere, but that person was a reflection of who we were. And that helped create the broader belief in human continuity from the ape. But the other one really was the sense about ruination, that people would have to somehow come to this astonishing realization that their body is made of, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, which is a story that they couldn't think without these ruins within. And hence the metaphors would begin to multiply as to what am I as a kind of physical being if I have untold generations.
Well, we still see that like in psychology, right? I mean, we commonly speak about the lizard brain, right? I think you're quoting, right? People, you refer to Trump, lizard brain, and the lizard brain lives within. I know in my area of behavioral finance, we always talk about, don't let the lizard brain make your investment decisions and so forth, right?
Yes. Yes, and so I think that the lizard brain is one particularly sort of salient case where we have an easy expression that we all know what it refers to, because we don't want to talk about the unconscious anymore. The sort of psychoanalytic terms, they sound just too difficult to speak of it. But the lizard brain sounds really dangerous somehow. And so that stays into the story. I was going to try and come up with another.
This whole debate, about the merits and flaws of intuition, right, that we see in cognitive science. I mean, it seems like almost like a rehashing of this, discussion of the human, right? The uniquely human. The uniquely human is the rational bit, and the emotional bit, that's the part that is still kind of, contiguous with the ape self.
Exactly. And what you were saying before with the other example different from the lizard brain. It's like, okay, so if we are part Neanderthal, what does that actually give us? Does it actually mean anything? I remember when I was starting the book and just amassing stuff that you would see things in Scientific American about how Neanderthals were depressed and they were easily addicted and there were this and there were that. And you're like, well, maybe, but the idea shouldn't be that we immediately transplant a modern category and a very, very contemporary category of what depression means in order to reconstruct that. Rachel Kushner's new book, Creation Lake, talks and makes fun of some of this, or this kind of commitment or the idea that we can easily do this kind of translation back and forth. And this is what interested me, this loop back that brings us into talking about the now. What I would say to this is that part of the problem really is, as we said from the beginning, it's about this, who are we? If we can begin to admit that in a way, we are people who are culturally fundamentally different, economically fundamentally different. Our lemons come from half a world away, the meat that we consume from another half a world away, and so on. If we come around to understanding that our family structures, our relationships, our religious questions are structured in a different form, that our world is technologically bound, and that ultimately, one way or another, we have biological connections, but even our microbiomes must be fundamentally different from what ancient microbiomes were. Then we will not end up having this need to say, here's where it's all began. And, the march of humanity was this or that. It was a Hobbesian story, and look how great it is now. It was a Rousseauian story, and look how great our pure original selves are. Maybe we can actually come to understanding both what we mean as beings now, and that this is not fundamentally a biological being that we're speaking of. But, what anthropologists and sociologists and others are trying to understand, but a really contingent, sometimes violent, sometimes violated being that we have to be able to understand on different terms. Not because there's something, inherently wrong, but because the self-delusion is multiplying in a way. And we keep pretending that the harm that we do is somehow linked to this Rousseau-Hobbes story, as opposed to the harm that we do today and yesterday and tomorrow. So,
well, throughout the book, you mentioned in the book that there are these sort of triads that keep reappearing in one form or another. I guess this seems something about our storytelling that always cuts things into threes. But I mean, there was the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. There was, I think it was Saint-Simon who had the theological, the metaphorical, and the positive eras, the magic, religion, science, and even like the economists like W.W. Rostow had, right? Underdeveloped, yes. Developing, and developed. They all represent very different notions of progress, but I guess the yes. underlying story is very similar across. The trope is the same, even if it manifests itself in different ways, right?
Right. It's as though we need certain. So first of all, a lot of the issue is clearly pedagogical, right? It's not even just about making science public and the problems that happen when we make science public. But a lot of it is that this material is material that we learn at particular given moments at school. And so in the secular society, and most secular societies, you do get to go through this setup. So now the question becomes, how do you end up teaching it? And I think some of this was easy to teach. Some of it was linked to legal so questions of international law or questions of scientific accounting, let's say. Why international law? Because the question is, what are your relations with the people that you have colonized going to be like? Can they be brought to have consciousness of statehood? And so are you in a kind of mandate situation over a semi-civilized, potentially promising people, or are they, people who need to be contained? And as the British, fought wars all over Africa every single year of the 19th century, or almost, this was really quite key for them. As regards the scientific side, I tried to explain a little bit in the book, and I wish I'd taken a bit more time with this, that Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age argument really ends with an Iron Age that is imagined as both antique, but also speaks to the Industrial Age, the new Iron Age. And that transcription is a transcription across translation, I suppose. It's a translation across both time and space, because there are people who do not use iron tools or who are reported not to have any welding stories. So you can mark the world as existing in different times, even though you are sharing space and air with somebody. This to me was really incredibly fascinating. And so the typologies then multiply. And 3 is an easy number. 4 was also an easy number for Adam Smith. And so Rostow is somewhere between the two terms too. But in a way, it became so straightforward that we kind of replicated over and over. I don't think that I've covered that story nearly enough. And there's a couple of books that I would, easily point to regarding the idea of the West, for example, by Georgios Varoufakis, that's forthcoming, that would tell us a lot more on this. But this idea that you don't just get linear history, you don't just get a history of the world that's somehow an ever more complicating thing, but you need to get categories that we can easily understand. Once people get to understanding things as more complex than this, the categories then keep returning. For example, in documentaries on TV, because they need to be really condensed. Because how long are you going to spend on a BBC documentary talking about these, what the division is going to be? The French, I would venture to say that while we all know some of these, very few of us know the terms Solutrean, Magdalenian, and Orignation, which are key terms in the understanding of cave art and especially of tools in France, and which are at the same time no less Eurocentric to the extreme, in that all tools around the world were then categorized on the basis of these particular ones.
Well, there's a quote that reappears from Descent of Man in the book a couple times, and it's about Darwin talks about the increasing scope of human societies and how this inevitably leads to the replacement of some by others. And this could be taken as a justification of imperialism, or it could be taken in a Pinkerian way as a optimism about, global empathy, right? I mean, is there a way that, will we ever get to a point where the normative, the kind of humanistic ideals that so many people share can exist independent of the narrative of humanity? Or, do we need to have some narrative of humanity in order to actually give a humanistic vision some teeth, right? So that people can walk around with these normative. Do we need a connection? I know I had a political philosophy professor once who said that you cannot have a political philosophy without a view of human nature. Can we separate the science from the politics?
So I end the book by arguing that no. I am willing to admit that I think that is one position. It's not the only possible position. I do think that the science will always have, let's not pretend that we're better than the people who came before us. The science will always have some sort of political implication in it. We're just not seeing what it is most of the time. And it'll take a little while until somebody can come in and discuss that as well. Do I think that the normative ideals are possible to take out of the ugliness of some of this material? Yes. A lot of questions, first off, recognizing that there have been fundamental problems with the story is one path to recognizing that some of the things that we believe in and some of the hopes that we want to set are not necessarily bound by that story entirely, nor were they ever necessarily or entirely bound by that story. I don't think that, moral arguments would have ever utterly depended on the on human origins research. However, the fact that they didn't in the past necessarily depend, and the fact that today they don't always necessarily depend, doesn't mean that this isn't some sort of larger conceptual web into which we find ourselves, or larger web of ideals, or of to some degree fantasy that we're in. I'm hoping basically that the book helps take a step back and say, like, okay, fine, even if I think that there is a happy ending to the story, in that, this isn't the horrors of 19th century colonialism, nevertheless, I can look at this with a measure of criticism and a measure of care, and I can say, okay, let's move into thinking what human nature is or might be or could be, or what the human would end up being, without being necessarily bound by some of the darker versions of that, and that perhaps I can even replicate the criticisms that this book guides toward the idea of human origins onto other domains as well. Because it's not as though, one domain was where all the horrors happened and then everything else was. I also don't want to simply pretend that this is simply a story of horrors where everything else is somehow grand. No, it's every part of this is mixed, but this is one place where you see the symptoms, I think, very clearly. So I do think that we can, use this kind of skepticism and the critique that I pay, a lot of time trying to build in the book, cautious critique, not denunciation, in order for us to end up at a point that's meaningful and consequential in terms of what these normative ideals might be once again.
The book's a book of history, but it's also got a lot of anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, genetics. I mean, it's got a lot in here. I highly recommend it. It's called Invention of Prehistory. Stefanos, thanks so much for joining me. Appreciate it.
Greg, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure of a conversation.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.